Hello friends, I am Dr. Rohini Ruhil. So today we will talk about global dialogues on climate change, that what were the major global dialogues on climate change over the time period, and what were the gaps and challenges that were there in these global dialogues. So, global dialogues on climate change covers a wide range of international discussions and international negotiations, and all these focused on tackling one of the biggest issue the world is facing today. And which is the biggest issue the world is facing today? Yes, the climate change. And a lot of the conversation usually centers on cutting down greenhouse gas emissions, making sure countries share the responsibility of controlling these emissions, and working together worldwide to lessen the effects of climate change. But however, despite this common goal, these conversations often reveal significant gaps and challenges, which we will discuss in this video. So let's understand them in detail. Now, the global climate agenda includes various international treaties, national policies aiming to mitigate climate change and transition towards a sustainable future. So let's look at them one by one. So, first of all, the world leaders showed concern for the environment for the first time in a global conference in Stockholm in 1972. This Stockholm conference marked the beginning of the global dialogue on the environment. And there was a simultaneous publication of Limits to Growth, which pointed out challenges of economic growth towards environmental sustainability. This marked the beginning of a global dialogue on the interconnectedness of human activities and the environment. And although climate change was not a central focus at that time. So this is how it started. Then in 1988, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, was established. And IPCC aimed to provide the world with a clear scientific view of climate change and its potential impacts. And its formation was the result of a collaboration between the World Meteorological Organization WMO and the United Nations Environmental Programme UNEP. And the work of IPCC is divided into three working groups. Working group 1 deals with the physical science basis of climate change. Working group 2 addresses impacts, adaptation and vulnerability. And working group 3 focuses on mitigation of climate change. And apart from this, the task force on national greenhouse gas inventories that develops methodologies to estimate emissions of greenhouse gases. So this was the establishment of IPCC in 1988. After that, the Earth Summit in Rio in 1992. This Rio Summit led to the creation of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And this framework convention, this treaty provided a framework for negotiating specific international agreements, and these agreements are aimed at combating climate change. Then coming to the 1997 Kyoto Protocol adopted in Kyoto, Japan. This protocol was a landmark agreement under the UNFCCC, and this Kyoto Protocol, what it did was, like, it committed its parties to internationally binding emission reduction targets. Industrialized nations committed to reducing their collective greenhouse gas emission by an average of 5.2% below 1990 levels over the 5-year period from 2008 to 2012. So this Kyoto Protocol was the first agreement to set quantitative targets for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. After that, the Paris Agreement 2015. This was a pivotal landmark international commitment aimed at confronting climate change. This agreement is now endorsed by almost every nation on the planet, and it strives to significantly cut down on global greenhouse gas emissions. And the goal is to keep the rise in global temperature below 2 degrees Celsius and further efforts to cap it at 1.5 degrees relative to the pre-industrial levels. And it was reached during the 21st conference COP21 in Paris and took effect in November 2016. And a cornerstone of the agreement is the obligation for each participating country to present ambitious targets for reducing emissions. And these ambitious targets are known as NDCs, nationally determined contributions, NDCs, and to enhance these objectives over time. And it also compels nations to report frequently on their emissions and progress in reaching their targets. And additionally, there is a collective review after 5 years to gauge the global progress. So this was the Paris Agreement, which was very significant. Then, then annually, since 1995, the conferences that followed COP21, they have focused on implementation of the Paris Agreement. Each subsequent COP attempts to build on the work of the previous COP and to refine the details of how the agreement operates, how to ensure the signatories to meet their commitments. And the significant conferences include COP25 in Madrid in 2019 and COP26 in Glasgow in 2021. COP25 was essential because it was tasked with finalizing the rules for implementing the Paris Agreement, particularly implementing the Article 6 of the Framework Convention, which deals with carbon markets and other forms of international cooperation. And one of the key achievements of COP26 was the Glasgow Climate Pact. And in this Glasgow Climate Pact, countries agreed to revisit and strengthen their 2030 climate plans and to align with the Paris Agreement of the temperature goals. And this Glasgow Climate Pact, this marked the first time that the UN climate talks agreed to explicitly plan to reduce coal power, although the final language was softened to phase down the coal rather than phase out the coal, which was rather later on achieved in COP28. So COP28, held in December 2023 in Dubai, was a notable event in climate negotiations. It achieved a significant consensus with nearly every country agreeing to transition away from fossil fuels, a first in the 28 years of such international discussions. And this COP28, it saw the operationalization of the loss and damage fund on its first day, marking a significant step in assisting climate vulnerable countries to handle impacts. Finally, countries are called to submit a new, more ambitious nationally determined contributions, submit their NDCs well ahead of COP30, which is to be held in 2025. Now, although the global climate agenda underpinned by various international treaties and national policies, this global climate agenda aims to mitigate climate change impacts and transition towards a sustainable low carbon future. But despite these efforts, there are several limitations and gaps within the current framework that hinders its effectiveness. So let's discuss them one by one. One of the most critical limitation is the inadequacy of global emission reduction targets. IPCC has highlighted the necessity to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius to avoid catastrophic climate impacts. However, the NDCs, nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement, these NDCs are insufficient to meet this target, projecting a pathway towards a 3 degrees Celsius increase. And this is in the report of UNEP in the 2019 report. And this gap between the ambition and reality underscores the need for more stringent and legally binding emission reduction targets. Now, the financial mechanism established under the Paris Agreement. This financial mechanism was a landmark commitment. And despite the critical importance of this financial pledge, its realization has been fraught with several challenges. The OECD reported significant shortfalls in reaching the $100 billion goal, highlighting the gap between pledged contributions and actual disbursements. This shortfall has several implications for global climate change response. And what are these shortfalls? Like, developing countries often rely on external financial support to implement their NDCs, and the shortfall in promised funds limit these countries' ability to pursue ambitious climate actions. And particularly in those sectors which require significant investment, such as renewable energy infrastructure, energy efficiency improvements, climate resilient developments. So this was regarding the shortfall in the financing for climate actions. Now, the issue of inclusion and equity within the global climate agenda, this is very critical. It highlights the disparities between those who have historically contributed least to the climate change and those who are most affected by its impacts. The vulnerable populations such as indigenous people, women, rural poor, they bear the brunt of climate change despite having a minimal role in its causation. This discrepancy raises significant ethical and justice concerns, necessitating a re-evaluation of how climate policies are formulated and implemented. Then, the technology mechanism established under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, this technology mechanism was designed to support the development and transfer of technologies to developing countries. However, the effectiveness of this mechanism has been limited by several barriers. What are those barriers in the transfer of technology? One is the intellectual property rights. Intellectual property rights have emerged as a critical barrier to technology transfer. Patents and copyrights on green technologies. This can increase costs, restrict access to latest innovations, especially for the developing countries. Then, the absence of adequate infrastructure in many developing countries. This is another significant obstacle. So this was regarding the challenges in technology transfer, especially for the developing countries. Then, addressing the loss and damage, the establishment of the Warsaw International Mechanism, WIM, the Warsaw International Mechanism for Loss and Damage in 2013. This marked a significant step forward in acknowledging the need to address the impacts of climate change. The WIM is specially aimed at supporting vulnerable countries in managing and recovering from the losses and damages associated with the effects of climate change. One of the main issue in operationalizing its mandate is the lack of clear mechanism for compensation and financial support. For example, the concept of loss and damage, it encompasses a wide range of impacts from physical damage to infrastructure damage, land, and more intangible losses such as loss of biodiversity, cultural heritage, even loss of identity. So, quantifying these losses and attributing them directly to climate change, this poses significant challenge. And this complicates the efforts to establish a mechanism for compensation. So this was regarding the gaps in this loss and damage mechanism. So at the end, addressing these issues requires a concerted effort from all stakeholders. And I would recommend that encouraging local innovation through supportive policies, funding for research and development, partnership with international research institutions. This can help adapt climate technologies to local contexts and needs, enhancing their effectiveness and acceptance. Also, by integrating issues of inclusion and equity in the climate agenda. So, by this way, policies could be more effective and just, and ensuring that no one is left behind in the global effort to combat climate change. So, with this, I end my presentation. Kindly like the video and subscribe to the channel. Thank you very much. Thanks for watching the video. See you in the next video. Thank you.